So let's get started. I am excited to study with all of you about a topic that I think is a really important one, that is about Pesach, but that transcends Pesach. We're going to take a look at some texts today that are about questions in Judaism. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'll invite you to join me in the blessing for study. For those who are, I see most of you are regular La Asok studiers, so you know this blessing. A couple of you are new to La Asok, and we always start every learning session with this blessing for study. So if you'd like, you can unmute and we'll join together in the words of the blessing for study. Please join me. Baruch
אתה
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah. Which means, blessed is the eternal source of the universe whose commandments make us holy and who commands us to immerse or to engage in words of Torah. So, all right, I want to start off with, we use the chat feature for this. I mentioned in the email I sent out this morning, for those who received it, I asked you to think about elements or areas of Jewish life that involve questions or questioning. So let me invite you to use the chat for that. If you can think of elements of Jewish life that involve questions or questioning, let's put them into the chat now, and we'll see what we can come up with. I'm going to give people a minute to type, and then we'll go through what you said. Susan, all of it. I like that. Yes, we'll come to that. That's kind of where we're heading with this. So you all are coming up with things that I didn't even think about. So I see lots of Torah study. I see affirmation, marriage, conversion, the notion of Beit Din as being a place of questions. Absolutely. Let's see what else you've got here. Ginger says, why do bad things happen to good people? Right. That what we call theodicy, that question of, what is the meaning and why is there suffering in the world? That's the big question, right? Asok classes, yes, Mel's, thank you. Absolutely. Try to fill our study space with questions. Every aspect of Jewish life involves questioning. That's how we learn, says Janet. Wonderful. So some really great answers here. Passover, yes, Vicky, and I'm glad you put that, because that's where we're going to start, right? With this notion that Passover begins with questions, but in fact, there's something larger here about questioning that's not only about Passover, but that is really about Jewish life. So let me start with a little bit of show and tell here. On this page in front of you, is everybody seeing my screen? On this page in front of you, you see two pages from different illuminated Haggadot. The one on the left is from what's called the Sarajevo Haggadah. Sarajevo Haggadah is a famous Sephardic Haggadah. It's 13th century or 14th century. It was created in either Spain or Portugal. I can't remember. It is the subject of this novel, which is called People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. A wonderful book. I actually restarted it last night, inspired by preparing for this class. And what you see in this photo on the left is the Nishtanah, the 4 questions, the illuminated manuscript version of it, the big, beautiful word ma up here at the top. On the right side, this is from, I don't know a lot about this Haggadah, but it's called the Chilek and Bilek Haggadah, and it's Ashkenazi, it's 15th century. And what you see here seems to be a family sitting around the Seder table. And what are they possibly saying? They are very possibly saying these words, or singing these words that many of us know. Ma Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol halelot. Right? That is the question of Pesach. Why is this night different from all other nights? And that is, of course, the topic of the title of this class, Ma Nishtanah, which means in Hebrew, why is it different? And in this case, we're talking about why this night is different, but we're using that as a larger question to ask about why questions matter in Judaism. So what are the questions of Pesach? Well, on all other nights, we eat leavened products and matzah, and on this night, only matzah. On all other nights we eat all vegetables, and on this night only maror, bitter herbs. On all other nights we don't dip our food even once, and on this night we dip twice. On all other nights we eat sitting or reclining, and on this night we only recline. So without getting into the particular content of the questions, although maybe that'll be pertinent to this question, why do you think questions are important in the Seder? Thinking about the Seder as an experience, why do questions, and let's if you have a thought on this, you can raise your hand electronically or you can drop it into the chat. Why do questions sit at the center of the Passover Seder experience? So I see Amy. Go ahead, Amy, and then Bob, and then Peter and Joy.
To draw people in, help them have some desire to participate. They're not just supposed to sit back and listen. They're supposed to be as engaged as possible.
Great. Okay, so this notion of drawing people in, right? Questions help people be engaged. Questions help people not only sit and listen, but, to use our language, la'asok, to engage in the words of and in the experience of the Seder. Bob, go ahead.
Well, as you said, Seder means order. And as a boomer, I know what a tendency there is to impose order on everything. And there's nothing like a question to disrupt that and to make it more interesting and more engaging and ultimately more fun.
Well, that's very interesting. So the questions are, in a sense, subversive to the Seder, right? If Seder means order, then the questions disrupt the order. And when things are disrupted, we pay better attention. I like that. I think we might come back around to that idea. Dawn says in the chat, the Socratic method of questions and answers is one of the best ways to teach and learn. Right. So rather than me standing here talking at you, you asking questions and me answering, or us answering each other, is a good way to engage people in learning. Peter and Joy, and then Paula, and then maybe Aviva.
I agree with what was said. I think, as you said, the first person that talked, I look at it as a jumping off point, because without the questions, there's no need for the rest of the story, no need for the answers.
Great. Yes, I like that. Rabbi Paula, go ahead.
So we're commanded to teach our children. And rather than lecture our children, one of the best ways to teach a child is to ask the question and see whether or not they can think up an answer. Kids are very often much more creative than adults. So if we were to ask them, why are we sitting kind of floppy and leaning over? They might come up with all kinds of answers, who knows? But
Right.
it encourages discussion.
Yes, and it also, to sort of riff off of what you're saying, it actually engages people to think critically, right? If you tell me a story or tell me something that happened, I might not listen. But if you ask me, why are we doing this? Then I'm going to be engaged to come up with answers. So it makes us active members of the learning experience. And, if we look again at this picture on the right, you see that every member of the family is engaged in the experience. I assume that this is the father on the right. Look at them wearing 16th century garb, right? That you have two children and you have a mother. They're all lifting up their cups. He's pointing to the Haggadah, but the kids are also holding up their cups. Everybody's engaged here in this experience. There's a democratizing aspect of questions that includes everybody. So I know there are a couple more comments, but let me actually move us to another text. And if the comments stay pertinent, then please keep the hands up. This is one of those where I have a lot of material I want to get through, but I also want to hear what you all have to say. So taking what all of you have said, I want to turn us for the moment to the Talmud. This is from Tractate Pesachim. You can see the word Pesach there in Pesachim, right? This is the tractate of the Talmud that deals with matters of Pesach. And this comes from the Mishnah, which is the earlier stratum of Talmud, around the year 200, 220 or so. And what the rabbis are doing here is describing the Seder of the Seder, the order of the Seder. Remember that the Passover Seder is not a biblical phenomenon. The Passover Seder actually comes into existence after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70-ish. Well, the temple was destroyed in 70. Seder comes about after that sometime because the rabbis are looking for ways to celebrate Pesach in the absence of a temple. They're looking for ways to engage us, and so they create this process of storytelling that today we call the Seder. And here we are, we've come to the second cup. It says, the second cup has been poured for the leader of the Seder, and now the son asks his father. I could have gender sensitized this language, but the original actually is in the masculine. But of course, at our Seders, this would involve children and parents of all genders, right? So now the children ask the parents. Ask what? Well, they ask questions, right? And we're told that if the child does not have the intelligence to ask questions of his own, which would be likely by virtue of age or possibly cognitive ability, then the father teaches him the following. Ma Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol halaylo. Why is this night different from all other nights? As on all other nights we eat unleavened bread and matzah, on this night only matzah. Familiar, right? As on all other nights we eat many vegetables, and on this night bitter herbs. As on all other nights we eat roasted, stewed, or cooked meat, on this night only roasted. As on all other nights we dip once, on this night twice. So the parent coaches the child who needs coaching, to ask these 4 questions, and then according to the intelligence of the child, the parent teaches them. So first of all, this is really good pedagogy, right? You have to teach according to somebody's ability, somebody's capacity to understand. You don't teach a 3-year-old the same way you teach a 16-year-old, and you don't teach, you teach people according to how they might understand the story. There are 2 very interesting aspects to me of this text. Anybody see anything interesting or surprising about this paragraph here? Anybody see it? Rabbi Paula, go ahead. And then Vanix.
I thought everybody would see it. Those aren't the questions we ask.
Well, 3 of them are, right?
But that 3 of them are, but one of them is not. Meat, cooked meat, stewed meat, whatever.
Right. Correct. So that's one thing that is interesting or surprising about this. Joy and Peter, do you see the other thing?
Well, it's only one question.
Right. Okay. It's only one question, which, by the way, the 4 questions are only one question with 4. In Hebrew, they're called the arba kushiot, the 4 difficulties or challenges, right? So it's really, we say 4 questions in English, but there's only one actual question, but it does raise up 4 different things that are worth noting, things that are worth asking about, which is a question, even if it's not in the form of a question. Dawn, what do you see here?
The 4th question here is actually the 3rd question that we would ask in our Haggadot. Our children would ask that. And then there's the 4th question that we've added about reclining, obviously. So they take out the stewed meat one and then they add the reclining one, but they put the dipping one 4th here as opposed to what we have as 3rd. The order's changed, that's all.
Yep. So one thing to notice is that the order and one of the questions is changed. This has to do with the evolution of how people ate and lived. At a certain point in the year 200 or so, there were laws surrounding how you were allowed to cook the meat during the Passover meal, and on this night it's only to be roasted versus any other form. That sort of went out. After the temple was gone, people stopped sacrificing. The Seder meal became a meal where it didn't matter as much how you cooked your meat. You have a roasted shank bone, but you don't have, it doesn't matter how the other meat is cooked on your table. And so this question went away and was replaced with the one about reclining that we know. The other thing that I noticed, which to me is even more interesting and surprising, is this part right here. If the son does not have the intelligence to ask questions of his own, then his father teaches him the Nishtanah. In other words, at your Seders, how many of your Seders include the Nishtanah? Raise your hand if your Seder includes the Nishtanah. I believe everybody's Seder includes the Nishtanah, right? According to this, whose Seder should include the Nishtanah? only those that have children who are too young or for whatever reason not able to generate their own questions. The best form of questioning at a Seder is actually the one that we generate ourselves. Nishtanah is only here as a script in case we need help, in case we need a jolt or some extra help to come up with questions for tonight. In fact, if we go a little further in the Talmud, we see the rabbis debating various ways to get kids to come up with questions of their own. Our rabbis taught everyone is obligated to drink 4 cups of wine, whether men, children, or women or children. So Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, what do you mean children? My children love this. They would love to drink 4 cups of wine. But come on, you're going to have a 3-year-old drink 4 cups of wine? That's silly, says Rabbi Yehuda. I have a better idea. Rather, you should distribute parched grain and nuts to them on the day of the Seder so they will not sleep, and they will ask questions. Forget about wine. Give kids popcorn. Keep them awake. What's wine going to do? It's going to put them to sleep, right? We need our kids awake on Seder night. Give them fun snacks. Give them exciting things. You can, by the way, you can see here that the rabbis weren't worried about kitniot, because what are they serving? Popcorn and nuts, 2 things that like popcorn and peanuts, right? 2 things that that Ashkenazim don't serve at Pesach anymore. They're not worried about that back then. Either way, they're giving out fun desserts and snacks to the kids so that they'll stay awake and ask questions. In fact, it is taught that Rabbi Akiva used to do this exact thing. He would distribute grains and nuts to the children on the day of the Seder so that they would not sleep and ask questions. And it's taught, this is my favorite, Rabbi Eliezer says, chotvin, we lift or whisk the matzah on the night of the Seder for the children so they will not sleep. Now this raises a question. What does chotvin mean? This is a weird verb. It means to snatch. So they're snatching the matzah. What does that mean? Well, Rashi says it means they lift up the plate above everybody so the kids will ask, why are you lifting up that plate? And I can say, well, let me tell you a story about why I'm lifting up this plate. Or Rashi has a second answer, number 2, which is we eat very quickly. Again, so that the kids will say, why are we eating so quickly? And we can answer, let me tell you a story. And then finally, the Rashbam says that this chotfin means taking away the matzah from the children's very hands so that they will not eat too much and fall asleep and they will ask about the changes. Can you imagine your child is like this, right? And you snatch away the matzah and the kid turns to you and says, hey, why are you taking my matzah? And that's when you get to say, well, I have a story. I'm glad you asked that question. I have a story. In fact, there's a story just like that in the Talmud. Let me show you this, and then I'll open up to some questions. Abaye was sitting before Rabbah at a Seder, and he saw the tray taken up from before him. He said, we have not eaten yet. Why have they already come and removed the tray from before us? Said Rabbah to him, you have exempted us from reciting Nishtanah. How did he exempt us? Because he asked a question. He said, why are you taking my plate away? And his rabbi, Rabbah, says, oh, since you asked a question, let's dispense with Nishtanah and we'll tell the story. So the questions of the Seder are supposed to be active questions. We're supposed to do things differently, eat things differently, arrange things differently, so that we will be involved in questioning. With the Nishtanah here, really, in case we can't come up with any questions of our own. Carol, go ahead. I see your hand up.
I'm not sure I understood correctly, but are you saying that if there are no children present, which was the case for me this week, that you can bypass the 4 questions?
I'm very glad you asked that question. First of all, I'm not making a halakhic ruling. I'm not telling you all don't say the Nishtanah at your Seders this year. I'm more raising a question of intent, right? What do the rabbis intend? The rabbis intend for us here to be actively engaged in asking questions. And Carol, that raises the question that you're raising, which is, what if there are no kids at the Seder? Do we still need to ask questions? And for that matter, do we still need to tell the story? And the Talmud, I think we probably all agree that the answer is yes, right? But you'll see in just a moment that the Talmud is going to address exactly that question in a really important way. Aviva, go ahead. Aviva, you're on mute. Are you able to unmute?
Off.
There we
I
go.
was just taking it off. We don't have any, well, we have one child coming, but we have many people coming who've never been to a Seder before. So they would be people who would be asking many questions.
Great. Yes, that's a great example, right? The Seder's not only for children. So let me show you two things. First of all, this just because I think it's fun. This is from I don't know this person, but I found this in a Sefaria source sheet from Rona Shapiro, who writes that at the beginning of Seder night, Jerusalem's Professor Reuven Feuerstein, world-renowned special needs educator, he always warns the children around the table. Tonight is Seder night. This is an important question, and we have much to read, so we cannot be bothered with all sorts of questions, he says. If you ask any questions, I will be forced to punish you by throwing lots and lots of candies at you. So clearly, we're engaging children in questions here, right? So there's our, how might you engage children? But we're now, both Aviva and Carol have raised this important question of, what if there are not children? What about the rest of us? And the Talmud addresses that as well by saying, in the Gemara, so the Gemara is the part of the Talmud that comments on the Mishnah. So this is a commentary on what we just saw. And it says as follows, the sages saw it. Sorry, if everyone can just mute, please. There's somebody who's got background noise there. The sages taught, if the son is wise, he asks him. And if he is not wise, the sages go on and then say, if the son is not able to ask questions, then the wife asks. In other words, spouses should ask each other questions. And if not, if you don't have your spouse or partner there, then you ask yourself questions. And this I think is the kicker, even two Torah scholars who know the halachot of Passover ask each other questions. So there's the rabbi's answer to Carol's question. What if I have no kids? What if I have, what if my Seder table is entirely populated by the greatest Jewish scholars in the world? Does that mean we don't need to ask each other questions? Well, no, the rabbis say you do. Even adults, even scholars, even if we think we know everything about Pesach, we still have to ask each other questions. And this, I think, raises a question for us, which is why? Why do the rabbis require that even knowledgeable adults must ask each other questions at the Seder? So I see Susan's hand, Aviva and Bob. Let's do short comments, please, and we'll address this question of adults asking questions. Go ahead, Susan.
Well, at my age, unless there's grandchildren, I would quite often be attending a Seder that has no children. And the way around who asks the four questions is you politely ask, who's the youngest person here? And the youngest adult does the chanting. But the question, why must adults ask questions, I think goes beyond the four questions. And even if you aren't talking about Pesach and the halachot of Pesach, there must be something that you could ask each other about.
Great. Yeah, I love that, Susan. And I agree. I think this transcends Pesach now, right? Because the rabbis are giving us a value, and I'll say more about this in a moment. The rabbis are giving us a value that questions must sit at the center of Jewish life, not only for children, but for all of us. Aviva, go ahead, and then Bob.
I think it brings in even more provocative thought and questions too, and you have so many different Haggadahs too that people have. I have a friend who had a feminist Seder, and I have the Harry Potter Haggadah. And so you have many different Haggadahs that people use.
Great, which all have different approaches, right? We have the Hamilton Haggadah that we used a couple of years ago. Great. So yeah, it brings in this.
My mom also, when we had our Seder when I was young, took big pieces of paper and cut holes in it. So we stuck our heads in the holes, and we took on the characters in the Seder. and she wrote like a script for us. So we were acting out the characters in the Seder story.
Nice. Thank you, Aviva. Bob, go ahead.
It's not necessary to refer to these other elements of the Talmud. If you just look in the text in the Haggadah, you've got Rabbi Akiva and all these other rabbis sitting around all night arguing and asking each other questions until finally their adult students come and say, hey, it's time for the morning Shema. So there were questions right incorporated as an example to us by the greatest of sages.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I like what Rachel just put in the chat. I think it's because essentially lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. If the Torah is not in heaven, then the Torah is right here in front of us and between us, where we make meaning by questioning and by calling into question beliefs, practices, and all kinds of things about the world. Rabbi Steve Greenberg, in his book Wrestling with God and Men, speaks to this. This is, I think, to Susan's point about this transcending Pesach. This is a core value of Judaism in general. He says the key to Jewish exegesis is to assume that nothing is obvious. Questions are the great cultural paradox. They both destabilize and secure social norms. So there you go, your questions as upending the Seder, upending the order of the Seder. The rabbis have built an upending right into the order, the very order of the Seder. And I like this little quote here. Nikita Khrushchev, one-time leader of the Soviet Union, once explained why he hated Jews. He said, they always ask why. Those pesky Jews are always asking why, right? Questions tend to democratize, he says. And I think this is a really important element of Jewish life, that questioning actually sits at the core of how we as Jews approach the world. So Pesach then is a kind of a microcosm for something larger about Jewish life. And what I want to do now is I want to show you what I think are two paradigms or models of questioning and wrestling in Jewish life, each of them based on a patriarch. And, to lay my cards on the table, we're going to talk about Jacob and then we're going to talk about Abraham, both of whom I think are seen as questioning and wrestling. And their questioning and wrestling, I think, provide two different models for us for Jewish life. So Peter and Joy, go ahead, and then I'll move us to Jacob.
I like the discussion so far, and it made me think about we have a good friend who is anything but Jewish. He's anything but anything, and we were talking. He was talking to us on the phone the other day, and he said, "Well, why don't you just serve the meal first, so the kids can be satiated." And then carry on with the rest of the Seder. And our answer to him was, that's not the way it's done.
Yep.
Interesting.
I will say about that, and Peter, you've probably heard my rant on this before, that I think we need to be serving more food earlier in the Seder so that people aren't hungry. The karpas blessing, the blessing over greens, I always think of, in our house, we call it the blessing over the appetizers. So I say put some food on the table so that the questioning can be fun rather than everybody being hungry. But I agree with you, Peter. The point of the night is not the meal, right? The point of the night is what goes on around the meal. So let's now widen this to Judaism in general. And like I said, two models or two paradigms of questioning and wrestling in Judaism. The first one is from the book of Genesis, where Jacob wrestles all night long with God, an angel, himself, whoever he's wrestling with. And it says, Vayomer lo Yaakov ya'amer od shimcha. He, this person that Jacob is wrestling with, says, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, Israel. For you have striven, wrestled with beings divine and human, and you have prevailed. So what is the meaning? Oh, and on the right here, you have Chagall's painting, which is called Jacob Wrestles with the Angel. I think it's a beautiful painting, like everything Chagall did. painting wise. So what is the meaning? What is sort of the imagery of Jacob wrestling? What is the meaning of the Jacob wrestling story for us? Any thoughts on that? Paula, please.
So I've always thought that this question of Jacob, tell me who you are, and the response about, well, who are you first? And Jacob says, I'm Jacob. But earlier in his life, he said, I'm Esau. So I think this is a little bit about this name change, and the wrestling is about Jacob beginning to realize who he really is, what his purpose really is. And the name change allows him to fulfill a purpose different than the one that he started out with as a young man. So to me, it's the wrestling is really internal, but to me that statement when the divine being or whoever or whatever it is says, who are you? And Jacob says, I'm Jacob, is a very, it's a watershed moment, because before that he was a very different person.
Yeah, I like that, Paula. Thank you. Like here we see Jacob wrestling and asking questions of himself, right? The wrestling is a questioning exercise as well, which is what draws this together with our topic here. Jacob, he's wrestling and questioning God, and he's also wrestling and questioning himself, sort of like always asking himself questions about who am I and how can I be best in the world? And I think that is an important paradigm here for Jewish life. That's why we're Yisrael. We are the people that wrestle. Somebody said it in the chat, right? The God wrestling people, but we're also the self-wrestling people. We are the community of wrestlers, the community of questioners. That's really what Yisrael means. Amy, and then Sarah.
Have it easy, seconding everything that was just spoken. I've always kind of understood everything as, yeah, right. He had intrinsic awareness. He was different. He knew who he genuinely was, but others were always saying, no, try again. You're something else. Somebody else, even. As a Jew by affirmation, and somebody whose legal name was different than her real name during childhood, can relate 100%.
Thank you.
Kind of lived experience.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, Amy. Yeah, so this sort of like process of becoming, right? And the wrestling, the questioning is then part of the process of becoming. Sarah, what's your take?
I think it's also about our kind of eternal struggle with what is our relationship to this God? Are we best buds? Is this our parent that we're constantly up against? Who and how do we be in relationship with this God who has embraced us, but also doesn't quite embrace us in the way we may want?
Yes, I appreciate you raising that, because that's the other side of the coin from what I think Paula and Amy were talking about, which is the wrestling with self, the becoming. You're talking about then wrestling with the relationship with God. What does God want of us in all the ways we imagine God, right? We as liberal Jews come to this study with all kinds of different theologies, and that's part of the wrestling. What does God want of us? What does it mean to be in relationship with God? The Torah suggests, and the rabbis embrace this idea, that we are a community of questioners and wrestlers. That's what it means to be Israel. And in fact, in this very famous story, I think they bring that idea to fruition of us as a community of wrestlers or questioners. The story goes, that for 3 years, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagreed. Doesn't matter what they disagreed on. The point is they disagreed. They both said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. They both said it, and neither one would give up until finally a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. This and this are the words of the living God. And then it says the halakha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. We're going to get to that in a minute. But first, it says that actually the point is not the answer. The point is the question. The point is in the wrestling. We are a community of questioners. That is the identity that the rabbis understand for themselves. It's an identity, that is the identity that Jews understand for ourselves based on who Jacob is, but also based on who we are and how we look upon the world. There could be more than one truth. We ask each other questions, and we recognize that the point is in the question and not the answer. And I want to argue that the rabbis actually are responding to something that had happened previously. Why are the rabbis, other than the Jacob story, which could be understood in a lot of different ways, why are the rabbis so invested in this idea of a community of wrestlers? I believe because they had inherited a Jewish world that had been torn apart by factionalism. If you know anything about the Second Temple period, you know that the Jews were divided into factions: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, what Josephus calls the fourth philosophy, whatever that is. There's all these different groups, and they are fighting against each other. And the rabbis tell these stories in the Talmud about the Jews essentially imploding because they're so busy fighting against each other. So for example, they say, why was the first temple destroyed? Because of idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Like bad things were happening during the first temple. But what about the second temple? During that, people were engaged in Torah study, mitzvot, and acts of kindness. The second temple shouldn't have been destroyed because of those kinds of things. They say, no, it was destroyed because of sinat chinam, causeless hatred, baseless hatred. The second temple was destroyed. The Jews imploded ourselves by fighting amongst ourselves. In fact, the rabbis tell this story. This is in Tractate Gittin, part of a much larger story about how the temple came to be destroyed. They tell this story that says that at the time of the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, when Vespasian is besieging the city, there were 3 wealthy people in the city whose names are Nakdimon ben Gurion, Ben Kalba Savua, and Ben Tzitzit HaKesat. Doesn't matter their names. And each of them says, oh, I'll feed the people. I will feed the residents with wheat and barley. I will feed them with wine, salt, and oil. I will feed them with wood. In other words, there's plenty of resources in the city of Jerusalem. We can wait out the Romans in our siege, right? If we just unite together, we can wait out the Romans. And what happened? There were certain zealots among the people. The sages said to them, let's go make peace with the Romans, but the zealots did not allow this. The zealots said to the sages, let us go out and engage in battle with the Romans. But the sages said, no, we're not going to win. So what happened? The zealots arose and burned the storehouses of wheat and barley, and there was a famine. In other words, we brought ourselves down by fighting. We brought ourselves down by not being able to handle difference of opinion and questioning within our community. We fought amongst ourselves because we as a people could not handle questions during the Second Temple period. And Dr. Shia J.D. Cohen, who's an important scholar of Jewish studies, has argued that that's why the rabbis are so invested in a community of questioners, a community of wrestlers. He says a major contribution of Yavne. Yavne is the rabbinic project following the temple, the destruction of the temple, where the rabbis come together to begin to create the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Talmud, and it's a 500-year project. But he says the major contribution of Yavne is the creation of a society which tolerates disputes without producing sects. For the first time, Jews agreed to disagree. He says the dominant ethic here is not exclusivity, but elasticity. The goal was not to triumph over other sects, but the elimination of the need for sectarianism itself. The destruction of the temple, he says, provided the impetus for this process. It warned the Jews of the dangers of internal divisiveness, and it removed one of the major focal points of Jewish sectarianism. Once the temple is gone, what are we going to fight over? We better create a community where it's okay to have difference of opinion. It's okay to ask questions. And so questioning comes to sit at the center of Jewish life, Dr. Cohen argues, because the rabbis saw the cautionary tale of what it had been like when we weren't able to handle questions amongst us, when we weren't able to handle being a community of wrestlers. And somebody put in the chat, the zealots are back. I think we are in a very dangerous time right now in which we as a people and maybe as a world have possibly stopped being able to ask each other questions. I addressed this in my podcast last week for those of you who are 7-Minute Torah listeners, the idea that we, rather than asking questions and being curious of each other, we tend to draw red lines over which we cannot talk to each other. The rabbis warn us against this, and they say that is the very reason that they are creating a Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel milieu. It's because we need to be a community of questioners. Which brings me back briefly to this text here about the voice from heaven that says, both these and these are the words of the living God, but the halacha is according to Beit Hillel, right? So how can it be the case that God says both are right? You know, they ask all your questions you want, but also Beit Hillel wins. And the answer, the rabbis say the answer is because the students of Hillel were agreeable and forbearing. They taught both their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. In fact, they prioritized the statements of Beit Shammai to their own statements. So when they went to study, they asked each other, what do you think? Why do you feel that way? They tried to understand how the other was seeing the world. Can you imagine if Jews and Palestinians tried to understand how each other was seeing the world, right? Can you imagine if Jews of different denominations tried to understand how each other was seeing the world? I'm not saying it's easy. I think it's really hard to do. The rabbis are saying actually that is the only way to be a community of wrestlers. That's the paradigm of wrestling and questioning that Jacob as Yisrael gives us. I want to show you a second paradigm, and that's the paradigm of Abraham. So here we go. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God says, I'm going to destroy the city. And Abraham says, what if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the 50 innocent who are in it? Far be it for you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Should not the judge of all the earth do justly? This is a different paradigm of questioning, right? Rather than Jacob wrestling, this is Abraham questioning. What is the meaning of this image, of this story of questioning? What does it mean about Jewish life? Amy, please.
Concern that equity comes in to complete effect, and that no one has any punishment they're not supposed to have, or flipped. If they're supposed to be punished, try me again. It shouldn't be denied. Acknowledge something as it is.
Yeah, so Abraham here actually raises a value as a question and says, hey, God, remember this value you taught me? Did you forget about it? Right? Abraham's question is actually a reminder of a value here. Paula, go ahead.
I think to some extent that question should not the judge of all the. This is a warning about authority, even if that authority is way beyond you or way beyond what you think. That if you understand that a wrong may be happening, that to question the reasoning of the authority, even if that means that you may suffer, is imperative. I think it's imperative. And I think that that really, really applies today, both here and in other places around the world, questioning the actions of authority, when you know that there are things that are going wrong.
Great. Yes, I think, and that's hard to do, right? And dangerous to do, right? To stand up and say, you know, there is something wrong going on here. And yet that is exactly what Abraham represents here, standing up to not even just authority, but the ultimate authority, right? This is God, and saying, no, there needs to be justice in the world. So the questioning here as Amy alluded to this as well, takes the form of the raising up of values and the reminding of authority and the world and all of us that there is a moral and ethical responsibility here. And that, to your point, Paula, I think that's about governments. It's about ourselves, right? You know, in what ways are we responsible to stand up and say things about governments that represent us, like the American or the Canadian or the Israeli governments, right? Or depending on what countries we live in or who we are, right? In what ways are we responsible to be the questioners here? So this is a very different meaning of questioning. This is a question that's kind of like a shattering of idols, if you will, to use Abrahamic language, a shattering of the complacencies. Sometimes they say that the role of religion is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. This is the afflicting the comfortable part of it. This is the don't you get too comfortable with, you know, thinking that everything's okay in the world. As you say, Paula, calling to responsibility and calling to ideals. This is also from a Haggadah. This is, I don't know this Haggadah, but it's called the Herlingen Haggadah from Vienna. It's an 18th century Haggadah, 1725. And this is Abraham smashing the idols in his father's shop. Many of you might know this story. It's a midrashic story about Abraham smashing all the idols in his father's store, right? Abraham's father leaves him responsible for the idol shop for an afternoon. And what does Abraham do? He just smashes them all, and he puts the hammer in the hand of the biggest one. And when his father comes back, Abraham points to the biggest idol and says, he did it. Right? And Abraham's father says, no, he didn't. He can't. And Abraham says, aha, do you hear what you're saying? I think it says literally, let your ears hear what your mouth is saying, or something like that. Yes, Paul is nodding. I got it right. Thank you, Paula. Right? So this is the origin of the term iconoclasm, or iconoclasm, the smashing of idols. Right? What are the idols that we smash these days? The idol of power, right? We as Jews are called upon to be the ones to stand up and ask questions about how things are, about how things are vis-a-vis how things ought to be. We are called as Jews to see the ought rather than the is. And that, I think, is the ultimate ethical question that Jews have to ask. And I added here, Jews are never to acquiesce to the way things are without asking serious questions about whether things ought to be that way. So, and actually, I wanted to show you one more text, and then we'll conclude. This is from non-Jewish novelist, Czech French novelist Milan Kundera. He's talking here about the novel. He's talking about, you know, the form of the novel. But I think in many ways this applies to Jewish life as well. I just liked what he said here. He said, a novel does not assert anything. A novel searches and poses questions. The stupidity of people comes from having an answer for everything. The wisdom of the novel, and I would suggest the wisdom of Jewish life as well, comes from having a question for everything. The novelist teaches the reader to comprehend the world as a question. There is wisdom and tolerance in that attitude. The totalitarian world is a world of answers rather than questions. I want to read that sentence again because I believe it applies to our world today. The totalitarian world is a world of answers rather than questions. And as a novelist, he says there the novel has no place. In any case, It seems to me that all over the world, people nowadays prefer to judge rather than understand, to answer rather than ask, so that the voice of the novel, or we might say the voice of what we're commanded in Jewish life, can hardly be heard over the noisy foolishness of human certainties. So let me pause now and just get your reactions. I have one last text to close with, but just reactions to this or questions about anything that we've talked about over the last little while. What's on your mind in this discussion? Paula and then Vanix.
So I want to tell a little, very, very brief story about what my son said was the best question anybody asked him ever. When my son was in his sophomore year of college, I had just come back from Israel, my year in Israel, studying. And one day he called with a very hesitant voice. My husband picked up the phone and he said, "It's for you, it's Steve." And so I said, "What's up, Steve?" And he was so nervous to say, he said, "Mom, I don't think I believe in God." And I said, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in. What is the God you don't believe in?" And that opened up an entire conversation that has continued, but it enabled him to really think about what his beliefs were and weren't. Because he said, I don't believe that God is with strings, maneuvering us or something. I said, let's talk. So I think that the question of what is the God you don't believe in really opens up some much bigger questions. And I think that there are times when we have to say, what don't I believe? What do I believe? What don't I believe? It's self-questioning. And that enables us to clarify better.
That's great. Yeah, and really trying to understand the other, right? Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? So for him, one of the habits is seek first to understand, then to be understood, right? We will better make ourselves understood if we seek genuinely to understand others first. So questioning is actually central to getting your point across. We think that to get our point across, we have to tell people things. Actually, we need to ask people things. We need to genuinely seek to understand if we want to be in relationship that is strong enough to be able to tell anybody anything. I want to go to Jesse, who hasn't spoken yet, and then Peter and Joy, and then I'll close this up. Go ahead, Jesse.
Hi. I actually have a really quick one. They always tell like college students that, the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. And put another way, you could say the more you learn, the more questions you have. Your questions just get deeper as time goes by, which makes me think of that quote from the Soviet leader, Jews always ask why. And it's like, yeah, because you can ask why until eternity. Spend time with a child, you can ask why they'll ask you why forever. And that's just the way it is.
Yep. I love it. Yeah, thank you for that, Perry. I remember when my youngest son was about 3, he was sitting at the table eating yogurt. And maybe he might have been 4 or 5. He must have been 5. He could read. So he turns to me and he said, "Daddy, why is protein good?" And he's reading the nutrition facts on his yogurt. So I'm all excited now to explain, well, protein builds muscles, and if you eat enough protein, and da, 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 da. And then he turns to me and says, "Daddy, do all bugs have mouths?" So he's just cycling through questions, right? Just curious about the world around him. When we show curiosity, we are better able to learn. That Judaism is trying to teach us to walk through the world with questions. Joy and Peter, and then I have one last thought.
Wanted to ask your question. You chose Jacob and Abraham as your exemplars, and especially Abraham. I thought Abraham was probably not the greatest choice, because if you look even farther back, Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And that is about as fundamental a question as you can get. Why not start there?
Nice. Yep, that is actually, that's a really nice ending. That That really is the fundamental question of human life. Am I my brother's keeper? By the way, the implicit answer is yes, right? And so certainly that would be another great way to frame this entire discussion about questions. Let me turn to one last text. Somebody actually just said something like this in the chat about scientists. This is from, if any of you saw Oppenheimer last year, Isidore Rabi was one of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project and an important physicist. And this comes from the Haggadah that's called A Different Night by Noam Sion. He writes that Isidore Rabi, the Nobel laureate in physics, was once asked, why did you become a scientist rather than a doctor or lawyer or businessman like the other immigrant kids in your neighborhood? And he answered, my mother made me a scientist without ever intending it. Every other Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, "Nu, did you learn anything today?" But not my mother. She always asked me a different question. Izzy, she would say, did you ask a good question today? That difference, asking good questions, made me become a scientist. So for Isidore Rabi, questions led him on a journey of discovery that led him to science. For us as Jews, questions are the journey that leads us to being our best selves and to helping make the world the best that it can possibly be. Like Jacob, we are a community of wrestlers and questioners. Like Abraham, we're a community of iconoclasts. We're supposed to ask questions about how the world is versus the way the world ought to be. And like those children at the Passover Seder, we are always supposed to always have our eyes open to the world around us and to generate questions so that all of us can get to know the world and help make the world better. So I want to thank you. I'll wish you a Chag Sameach, a very happy Pesach. Thanks for studying with me over the last hour, and I hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.